All right. Great. We have 380 people in the audience. That's awesome. So what I'm going to do today is just quickly give everyone a recap of the content that was posted yesterday in terms of how phase two golden points is going to work. And then after that TLDR, basically I'll start taking in questions on what the future for the chain holds. And I just need to clarify my role real quick. So as Pacman, I'm the CEO of Arcade Research, and you kind of think of us as a Blast development company, kind of similar to Consensus for Ethereum, and we're building products and services for the Blast chain. And then the Blast Foundation is in charge of the token and governance. So the Blast Foundation is really the one that's overviewing all of the token matters. But since I work closely with the foundation, I have a lot of good perspective, and I should be able to answer most questions with respect to the token. And I can answer a lot of the questions around the chain and the developments there. So I just want to give everyone that heads up, just kind of as like a legal precursor. All right, cool. So just to give everyone a quick summary of how phase two works, it's going to be quite similar to phase one. However, some of the learnings from phase one were that the gold distribution timing was difficult to plan around, and that made it very difficult for both users and devs to kind of know what to expect. So as a learning from that, in phase two, there's going to be gold distributions every month in the first week of every month. So the first phase two gold distribution will actually go live on July 8th. So that's the exception is this month's gold distribution will go live a few days later. But every month thereafter, there's going to be one gold distribution at the beginning of every month in that first week. The other thing that we'll do is the Big Bang competition was really great for bringing on new dApps. We noticed that as the phase continued, what ended up happening was there was a few dApps that launched early that progressed the most, and they ended up getting like the vast majority of the gold by the end. And it was difficult for new dApps to basically get noticed and get attention and get gold. So as a learning from that, each of the gold distributions in phase two is going to have a separate allocation for new dApps specifically, just oriented around highlighting those new dApps. And there are also going to be multiple Big Bang competitions to really bring in a lot of new dApps at once and really surface them and highlight them. I'm seeing some messages about not being able to hear me. Is that, are people able to hear me, or is the audio not working? Okay, great. Thanks for confirming, everyone. All right, and then within the gold allocations, the other thing that we learned was, for some of the dApps, some dApps distributed gold very quickly. Other dApps were slower to distribute the gold. And what ended up happening was there was a bunch of gold that was basically, left at the end of the phase. And the dApps had to kind of rush to kind of distribute all of them. So to work around that, not only are we doing the consistent gold distributions, but dApps are expected to distribute all of their existing gold before receiving their next gold distribution. And we also heard from users that some dApps were less clear in terms of what the gold criteria was. And that's something that was difficult for users and affected users negatively. So dApps are now going to be expected to outline the criteria for gold extremely clearly. And then on top of all that, dApps that use Blast, the token itself, in a novel and significant way, will receive a boost in their gold distributions. But stepping back a bit at a high level, there's a primary focus in phase two, which is around mobile dApps within the Blast app itself. And I can talk more about why that is and why we think that the future is heading in that direction. But really quickly, just want to make sure that everyone has a same page understanding of how gold is going to work in phase two. And then when it comes to points in phase two, it's very similar to phase one. The only difference is that there's one new asset that also earns points, and that's the Blast token itself. The other thing about phase two that's unique is that users of the Blast app will earn golden tickets. And those golden tickets give you points and gold, along with other rewards like Blast hoodies and Cybershucks. And excluding all those other rewards, the EV of the golden tickets is basically roughly 2x. So users with the Blast app will earn points at roughly 2x the rate of users who don't have the Blast app. So it's really, really useful for users who are earning points. And the reason why this incentive exists is primarily to reward the users who are using the Blast app and basically furthering the vision of building out the full stack chain. Okay, so with that basic foundation covered, I want to start taking a look at some questions. And let me just scroll through the side panel questions real quick just to see what are the most pertinent ones. So one person asks, can we delete referrals? There is no reason for it when it's really just people self-referring and diluting non-self-referrers by 24%. That's a great point. So for context, in phase one, there was a plus 16% boost for direct referrals and then a plus 8% boost for second level referrals. So it works out to about plus 24% as a boost if you self-refer. Of course, some people just referred like normal, other people just did self-referrals. And this person is pointing out that if you have this referral system, it creates this game where people who self-refer can dilute the people who don't self-refer. That is something that we recognize. If you'll notice in phase two, the referral incentive is not currently on. There is going to be an invite mechanism once the wallet functionality in the Blast app goes fully live. But until then, it's not turned on and people can just refer as normal. We'll have a mechanism that reduces the impact of self-referring. So that is something that we explicitly recognize was somewhat dilutive for the people who didn't play that game in phase one. And so that's going to be addressed in the phase two incentive system. I see someone ask, how long will phase two last? So phase two is at the longest going to last 12 months. The reason why is because a key focus of phase two is building out this full stack chain. And a core component of that is building out the Blast app. When you look at all of the different chains today, none of them really have a direct end user relationship. And that actually creates a number of limitations. Building out the Blast app is really, really important for the foundation of Blast as a chain. And so when we think through the timeline of what that's going to require, there's a few months required. Q4 is basically when the Blast app is going to come out. And then after that, it's going to take some time for dApps to basically adopt the primitives that are released through the Blast app. And again, this is all stuff that I can touch on more is because it's really, really important when thinking through the future of the chain. But 12 months was basically allocated in order to allow for that development cycle and adoption cycle. With that said, if the timeline gets accelerated for whatever reason, let's say Blast app comes out in Q4 and actually we start seeing an uptick and results from that sooner than expected, then the season or the phase two would actually potentially be shortened. So 12 months is more of like a ceiling. And if it's possible to reduce it because the timeline is progressing faster, then phase two will be shortened. Someone asked, how does vesting work? I've been at 0%. So for vesting, it's just based on your points. And basically the threshold is as long as you have around 80% of your liquidity, you will earn the full vest every month. And it actually ends up being about less than 80% because once the Blip 2 goes live and the Blast token starts earning points, it'll also contribute to your vesting threshold. Some users are seeing a 0% progress bar right now. That's a UI bug that's going to be fixed in the next few days. So for all those users, as long as you have around 80% of your liquidity on Blast, then your points will already be accruing and you have nothing to worry about. But it's probably scary seeing 0%, as a progress bar UI. So again, that is a bug currently, and that will be fixed in the next few days. And then this question that I'm seeing a lot of, and of course I was expecting it, is what are plans to boost Blast token utility beyond just governance? Any new features or use cases coming up? That's a great question. So before I answer this, I first need to preface. I have to answer this in a certain way just because of restrictions from our legal team. So I want to be conscientious of that. And in general, if you look at any project and you see any sort of communication that feels a little like weird or unnecessary, it's probably some reason to do with legal, and that's just like a good high-level framing for understanding the space in general. But with that all said, I can talk about tokens generally and give my thoughts on Blast. But I also need to preface that Blast is a governance token for the entire chain. It's something that, and the success of the chain is dependent on the builders and the community driving the chain forward. And any sort of value creation, driven to Blast has to come from the community at the end of the day. So with that all said, let me share my high-level thoughts. And so let me just collect my thoughts real quick and then I'll share. All right, so before I get into specific utility, I think it's really important to set some context. And the context that I want to set is around how do you value an asset? And this is going to be a little bit long and verbose, but I just want to break it down from first principles, and then you'll understand exactly how I think about tokens broadly and then Blast specifically. So how do you value an asset? For traditional business, right, like a business that you would see in the stock market, you basically look at the net present value of the future revenue, right? So you estimate how much revenue is this business going to generate this year, and then next year, and the year after. And if you model that out, you can work back to the net present value of the discounted cash flows. That model works for businesses, but that model doesn't really have much explanatory power for crypto assets. Where if you look at the highest valued assets like Bitcoin, they don't actually have any cash flows that you can model out. So looking at the DCF of the cash flows is a good model for businesses, but not for crypto assets. So how do you value crypto assets? A more explanatory model that works for both meme coins and Bitcoin alike is evaluating the net present value of the future flows to buy and sell the asset. So it's not what are the future cash flows, it's really what are the future buyers and what are the future sellers, and why are they buying and why are they selling. This model actually has much better explanatory power for the ecosystem. So Bitcoin has basically near infinite buy flows with its narrative as digital gold. And its sell flows become limited over time as more and more Bitcoin basically finds its way into the hands of diamond handlers. Meme coins also generate buy flows, right? The more a meme resonates with people, the more buy flows it generates. But meme coin also has a lot more sell flows because there are fewer holders willing to diamond hand that meme forever. instead of taking profits. Now, what about dApps? So on-chain dApps like Uniswap are basically a mix of a business and a meme coin. As a DEX, it can be evaluated similarly to like a normal exchange business, right? You can do like a standard DCF model for it. But Uni is also a symbol of like DeFi. And if you want to bet on DeFi, you can bet on Uni, and in that way, it's a meme coin. So the thing about meme coins, though, is that meme coin attention is fickle. So while Uni is currently doing well as like a symbol for DeFi, that can eventually go away. And fortunately for Uni, it can always fall back on its valuation as an on-chain business. Okay, so what about L2s? For the people saying I'm stalling, I'm getting to the full context of Blast, but it's really, really important to understand the background here because there's certain recommendations that I'm going to share that are probably not what people are currently thinking is going to be useful, but actually it's long-term, much more important. So what about L2s? As many of you know, it's an open secret today that L2s don't generate anywhere near enough revenue in the form of sequencer fees to justify their valuations. So they effectively trade as meme coins. And trading as a meme coin is fine, but again, the issue is that meme coin attention is fickle. And it's really, really important to have value to fall back on. What we've seen this cycle is that meme coin attention has flowed to two ends of the barbell. You have the right curve memes like Bitcoin, which is like the best meme of all. And then you have the left curve memes, which are actual meme coins. And they don't try to be anything other than meme coin. The attention that infra has as a meme is basically losing to the two ends of the barbell. And unless infra catches another wave of meme attention, it basically reprices to its business value, right? To its underlying fundamental intrinsic value, which is, for most chains, significantly lower than current valuations. Okay, so that's context on how to value assets. Now, what about assets for things that are actually somewhat business-like? Well, if you look at the best businesses on chain, funnily enough, it's not actually exchanges, and it's stablecoins. Tether and Circle both make money by pocketing the yield off of every USDT and USDC in circulation. In the last quarter alone, Tether made $5 billion in net profit. Almost every chain today relies on either USDT or USDC as their primary stablecoin. But there's one chain that doesn't, and that's Blast. And this is something that if you've been following my Twitter, you've probably been seeing me tweet a lot about. Blast has its own stablecoin, and that's USDB, which is natively yield-bearing. And as pretty much all of you already know, Blast ETH is also natively yield-bearing. Giving the yield to Blast users instead of pocketing it is effectively a disruptive business model to Tether and Circle. And for the people who've read the governance documentation, which, again, I don't expect that to be something that's widely read, but if you actually look at what the Blast token controls, Blast holders actually have the ability to turn on fees for both Blast ETH and USDB yield. And that's a significant monetization model that no other chain or L2 possesses. So in terms of the turning on utility for holding Blast, ultimately any of those mechanics are typically really short-term mechanics. They don't actually generate, what people want is they want to create reasons to hold Blast. The short-term utilities, though, they are basically just small bumps. They don't actually create long-term value for the Blast chain or even the token, frankly. What matters are long-term fundamentals which drive long-term flows. So if you step back Blast is currently only 4 months old, and it already matches or actually surpasses a large swath of chains that have been around for significantly longer. And this is still true even after TGE. Activity has gone down post TGE, right? That's super valid to look at. But even if you look at the activity today, it's still far greater than many other chains that have been around for years. So in terms of value capture for Blast, that comes, but rushing it only inhibits the net present value of the future flows, which is really what you want to optimize for. And what is like the timeline that actually makes sense here? That's something for the community to ultimately decide. But one anecdote that I will share that is really relevant is if you look at the biggest Web2 businesses in the world, these are businesses like Taobao in China, right? From those businesses waited multiple years. It was 3+ years. I think for Facebook, it was like 5 or 7 before turning on their fee switches effectively. They didn't really generate any revenue prior to that. So for Blast, the underlying chain growth is really what drives long-term value. And when I think about contributing to Blast, the only thing I'm really primarily thinking about is how can I contribute to the long-term chain growth? How can I also work with others in the community to contribute to long-term chain growth? Once you have that, Blast as a token does have mechanisms to actually capture value, which is what I just tried to outline. But of course, I'm sure I'm going to get more questions about that. And so I really want to, I cannot stress enough how important it is for the primary focus of the community to be on that underlying value. Everything else is basically just short-termism or just like, trying to generate like a meme. But again, the meme attention is fickle. Everything in this space that's not a meme basically falls back to its intrinsic value. That's the only thing that really you can control over the long term. Okay, so having said all that, I'm just taking a look at all the messages that I missed, and I want to either address any follow-up questions or other questions. Crew said, Pacman would be nice to have a showcase for new dApps. As a founder, it's hard to even get a retweet from Blast. So putting some kind of spotlight to new dApps would be nice to have. So the Blast Foundation is in charge of the Blast Twitter, but completely agree. That is something that we explicitly notice in phase 1. And Crew, I don't know if you heard this at the beginning, but in phase 2, there's a lot more focus on supporting new dApps. There is basically a separate allocation of gold, each distribution for new dApps specifically. There's going to be big bangs for new dApps. And beyond that, more will be done to support new dApps. So completely hear you, and I think that's a great point. Someone asked a great question, which is, now that we see the points meta coming to an end, yields dropping and attention fading, people are tired, why does the Blast team think it's a good idea to stick with the same meta for a second season? That's a great point. So I want to give some context on that. The points meta, to my understanding, there was no points meta before Blur did it for the first time. And the environment before Blur was users would typically use projects expecting some sort of airdrop, but it would never be explicit. And projects would typically like hint at some sort of airdrop. And that was basically like the default. And then eventually what would happen is projects would do some sort of like retroactive airdrop based on some criteria that they come up with. Now, after Blur, there is a points meta, but to understand why points were created in the first place, again, I need to build up from first principles why they were created. When you think about any sort of on-chain dApp or chain itself, any sort of structure in the market, the value of that structure comes from the users who use it. The reason why the blur points worked was because it effectively quantified very explicitly what the value each user was contributing to that structure. Similarly, for BLAST, the points are there to quantify very precisely how much value that user is providing to the structure that is BLAST. BLAST only succeeds if you get a large collection of both users, liquidity, and applications building on the chain and basically mashing together and creating a thriving ecosystem. The best way to actually quantify each user's contributions is through some sort of numeric system. So this is, basically copy pasted now by a lot of projects as like a, like quote unquote points meta. But the reason why it exists is not because it's some sort of like gimmick. The reason why it exists is because it actually allows each community member to basically know exactly where they fit in the food chain and know exactly how much they've contributed to the success of BLAST. So the points meta is not really something that I see going away because it was never created as some sort of marketing gimmick. It's really from first principles, the best way to allow users to understand how they're contributing to the ecosystem. Someone asks, we need a large effort in reducing the friction for bridging funds out of BLAST with low slippage. If people are confident about being able to withdraw funds without slippage in the future, they're more likely to bridge all their idle funds into BLAST for the native yield. That is a great point. So behind the scenes, there are a good number of large third-party bridges that are currently in the works with integrating BLAST. Those third-party bridges, they had to go through audits to, basically the way they work is that for each new chain that they add, they have to go through audits, and typically audits take months to schedule. So this is something that started actually months ago already, and it's something that we are expecting to go live in the very near future. So completely hear you on the friction for bridging out. That's not something that we want to stay as a state of the world. It's really, really important, in my opinion, for the success of BLAST as a chain to have really easy ways to both bridge on and bridge off. So that is going to be coming and improving. And someone just asked a relevant question. Can you please reduce the bridge time down from 14 days to less than a week at least? So the reason why it's 14 days is if you look at most chains, it's around 7 days. The reason why it's 14 days is because of the native yield aspect of BLAST. Basically, the native yield for BLAST is powered by Lido and MakerDAO under the hood. And in an extreme case, it could take Lido up to a few days to basically process a withdrawal. So, if normal withdrawals are like 7 days, and then you add in a few day buffer for those, third-party services underneath the hood, then that basically ends up adding to around 14 days. So it's, 14 days with a little bit of buffer. So it's not really something that can be easily reduced, but if there is a technical way in which it can be reduced while still allowing for that buffer, then absolutely, I think it could get reduced. At the minimum, 7 days is probably the minimum. But again, you need to allow for a few days for that buffer. Maybe 14 days is an overestimate. Maybe it's possible to reduce it beyond 14 days. I would need to speak with Eng on that. But that there's a reason for why it is that long. Someone asks, do you believe that you have a role to play in building community and culture, or do you expect culture to be built through dApps? I'm saying this in comparison to upcoming L1s like Berachain, Monad, or even Abstract, for instance, which put a lot of energy into creating a vibe and culture around them. It doesn't feel like that's a Blast path the Blast Foundation is taking yet, although it would make sense since you want to become the full stack chain that reaches a wider audience. That's a great question. So I can share my opinion, and I can't speak fully for the foundation, but I can just share my quick high level thoughts. When I think about the culture that's important, it's less so a culture around from the users that I think is important. I think it's the culture from the dApps that is much more important. And the culture that I really would want to impart is that at the end of the day, the boss of the market is the users. The users are the most important thing for any chain. The utility that the users are receiving, the value that they're receiving. This is a financialized market, and they need to be receiving as much value as possible. And dApps should really be orienting all of their energy around providing the maximum amount of value possible to users. When people talk about like mass market or retail, the thing about mass market and retail is that they don't really care about the culture aspect. People are very practical. They want to get value, and the only reason why they'll come onto a chain is because there's value there. So when I think through the culture, it's less about the vibes that I think are important. It's really about the dApps and their orientation around maximizing as much value as humanly possible for the users of the chain. I think that if that is done, then Blast will be a chain that has more opportunities and better infrastructure than any other chain, and that's ultimately how Blast wins as a chain. Someone asks, is the amount of gold distributed each month the same, or does it vary per month? And the answer is it will not be the same every month. And someone asks, in the Vision doc, you mentioned a TG app. Should we be worried? And I think this is from a Telegram bot creator. And answer is you should not. When we think through the full stack chain, the main thing is really around the wallet experience and the user's basically ability to onboard the chain to the chain from zero. Within the wallet experience, we totally see room for bots basically to live within it. There's a specific way in which we're envisioning that, though. Again, someone else asks in a somewhat related question, how will you compete with established players? What can you offer different with a wallet that others don't? This is a great question. It's something that I don't want to get too into for competitive reasons, but I think something to just give a hint of is if you look at wallets today, they are typically highly restricted in what they can do due to being like normal like App Store wallets. So this really limits their ability to become a platform. If you look at the Blast app, you'll notice something interesting. It's not a normal iOS app. It's actually a PWA. And this actually opens the door for a lot more design space than you would normally get in a normal app. So this is something that's going to be leaned into hard. This is a specific dimension that no one else has really leaned into on. That's really where we see all the juice coming from. But again, I don't really want to get into specifics on that because it is, as people have called out, a highly competitive market. Someone said, Fantasy made more than 4,000 ETH in revenue, but they returned a very little portion of it to Blast users. Any thoughts on that? So in terms of revenue, if it was something that like they promised to Blast users, then that should be returned. But if it was like, oh, they just like made that revenue, then absolutely, that's totally fine for them to keep. This is actually a common misunderstanding that we see, and that's on us, right? We need to clarify that better. But a lot of dApps think that the Blast Foundation doesn't want the dApps to make revenue. That's not true at all. We're very, very, very happy. The Blast Foundation is very, very happy to have dApps make revenue. The only thing that the foundation really watches out for is dApps using gold to directly incentivize revenue. A good mental model for this is, you can basically think like, oh, we're giving a dApp $1 million of marketing dollars, right? If the dApp wanted to, they could very easily say, to their users, we're going to sell this $1 million for $900,000, right? And so the users will do that, of course, because they're buying, dollars for 90 cents on the dollar. And then the dApps basically then get to pocket that $900,000. So they're not actually using the gold for its intended purposes, which is the marketing and growth of the underlying dApp. So what is not allowed is using the gold to directly incentivize revenue. But if the dApp is making revenue outside of the direct gold incentive, right? If they're using the gold to actually drive growth to their dApp and then through a secondary mechanism, they're actually making revenue, then that's like totally fine. So for Fantasy, they never explicitly incentivize, volume, which is what they make revenue off of. They incentivize, to my understanding, their bids, like liquidity, right? Bids on the different NFTs. And when people took those bids, then they generated volume, and that's how Fantasy generated revenue. So the gold was an indirect contributor, but it wasn't a direct contributor. And so that's why it was okay for Fantasy. And this is something that the foundation works closely with every dApp. And so if any dApp is trying to directly make revenue, that's completely okay. And the foundation will work with the dApps to figure out some sort of model that works if they're still also trying to use the gold. And again, any dApp can also just do whatever they want outside of the gold. It's just that there are certain policies when it comes to, if you're going to receive a marketing budget basically via the gold, then, here's how it should be spent. Okay, let me take a look at some other questions. Okay, here's one. I don't know if this is actually top question, but this person just put all these questions in bold. The top question was, there's no correlation between chain growth and the token. What's the value capture? So, for those who missed the long-winded explanation that I gave, Blast is actually a very unique chain in that it actually has significantly more mechanisms for value capture than any other L2 token. So for most L2s, they typically only monetize off of the sequencer revenue. And if you look at the sequencer revenue, it's basically not anywhere close to what it should be in order to justify that token valuation. Blast, unlike other chains, actually has a completely new monetization vertical, which is the native yield. And that is actually, if you look in crypto, basically one of the best business models that exists in this space. Blast, within only 4 months, has already built by many measures, the fifth or sixth largest most used stablecoin, in this space, and that's and on top of the native yield from the ETH as well. So for most chains, completely agree. There's no correlation between the chain growth and the token. If you look at, there are a lot of chains with far less activity and users and liquidity than Blast that have higher token valuations. But for Blast specifically, there is a tie. I don't think the market totally realizes that right now, but I am sharing that with you guys so you understand my mental model around Blast and the token. I see probably the most common question is, would it be possible to get 1.5x to 2x points more than ETH USD as an incentive for people to hold Blast rather than ETH USD? So again, when it comes to Blast as a token, I'll share my high level thoughts, and then the answer specifically for that is internally there's definitely discussion, and it's definitely something that we're considering. And in terms of actually implementing that, that's something that's that's currently TBD effectively. But again, I need to emphasize the core focus is always on maximizing the long-term value of the ecosystem. That's really why we see the point in any of this is really just creating that long-term value. The 1.5x points, it's basically like it's very similar to tokens that basically just like, have some sort of like self-staking mechanism, right? And what we've seen in the history of crypto is that those types of tokens actually, those types of mechanisms don't actually generate flows for the token long term. It's something that is commonly asked for, but it doesn't actually make a significant long term impact. So to the extent that it's something that's actually like valuable for the community, separately from the like token value, that's absolutely something that will be considered. But in terms of maximizing the long-term value, it's not something that there's a lot of attention on it. There's a lot of talk about it. And I think it's fine for there to be attention and talk about it, but it's really not something that's going to make a significant impact. Someone asked if a staked blast token, like in Wasabi and third-party protocols like Wasabi, do not earn blast points. No, they should. So points are earned by both EOAs and smart contracts. So I'm fairly confident that Wasabi redirects any points earned, whether it's from ETH or USDB or Blast, back to users. So those points will get redirected to you as long as Wasabi has integrated with the points API correctly, which I'm fairly confident that they have. And someone mentioned, Ax mentioned, speaking from my own opinion, but also many others share this view, gold system really doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Too many dApps are either abusing the gold outflows with no clarity, while other dApps are messing up their distributions of the gold they have. What ends up happening is many people have a significant amount of gold, more than others, while having done way less on-chain activity. How do we fix making the gold distribution more fair across the whole chain? So this is a great point, and this was definitely something that was noticed in phase one. And this is why there's multiple changes in the phase one gold distribution. One is they are made consistently at the beginning of every month. The dApps are expected to outline explicitly how they're distributing the gold. And then the dApps are also expected to fully distribute the gold before receiving their next distribution. And what this allows is it allows for close inspection of how each dApp is distributing their gold and an evaluation. The issue in phase one was that there was a very slow feedback loop, right? A lot of the dApps, they didn't have gold for a long time, and then when they did, it wasn't really clear how they were distributing it. And then, even then, maybe they still saved like 50% or more of their gold for like the last week. And so that made it very difficult to actually fully evaluate transparently how each dApp was distributing the gold. With the changes made in phase two, it's going to be much easier to actually evaluate that. And so I expect that sort of abuse or just messing up the distributions will be corrected much faster. So maybe it's possible for a dApp to get away with like one or two gold distributions that are suboptimal, but any sort of issues or mistakes will be caught within that period, and then further distributions will be corrected. Or if the dApp was acting like nefariously, then they don't get further distributions. So this new system basically allows for much more transparency and auditing. Someone asked, do previously exploited dApps have a chance at earning gold in season 2 if they relaunched? It depends on the dApp. It's really a case-by-case basis. It's as a high level, like answer, like yes, it is possible. But again, it really depends. If there was a dApp exploit just due to a history of negligence, then that's something where it's like, if it happened like 3 times before, it's probably going to happen a fourth. So, they're probably not going to get gold again, or be very, very hard. They have a high burden of proof. For a dApp that, seemed to do all the right things, but had an issue that was probably avoidable, but still, like you can kind of excuse it, then they're more likely to be able to get gold again. So, it is definitely possible. It's just that they'll probably be under more scrutiny. Someone asks, how do you attract degens from Base and Sol right now? Their biggest community is coming from meme coin community. How are you going to be number one chain for meme coin? It's a great question. So ultimately, when you look at how have change taken off, and really how have like bull runs in general in the crypto space happened? Fundamentally, every significant bull run, with the exception of this past one, which is like a universally weird one, and I can talk about that shortly. But everyone is actually driven by underlying technological and market developments. So, early on in the early 2010s, we had the rise of user-friendly exchanges, making it possible for people to on-ramp from fiat to Bitcoin. That drove its own cycle. In 2017, we had Ethereum making ICOs possible. This is basically allowing for capital formation globally, permissionlessly. It was driven into a lot of bad use cases, but as a fundamental new mechanic, it was basically revolutionary. It's what actually allowed Ethereum to exist in the first place, right? Ethereum was started off the back of an ICO. In 2020, it was DeFi, right? Uniswap made it possible to create tokens and exchange those tokens on-chain permissionlessly. That kicked off an entire DeFi summer. And then 2021, it was NFTs, an entirely new asset class, an entirely new distribution model for communities. So the fundamental theme behind all of this is underlying technological improvements, creating new metas. When we think through all of the recent metas, what has really been taking off on chain in this past year? A lot of it has to do with mobile, right? The common theme between Telegram bots, fantasy, friend tech, embedded wallets, all of these new metas have actually been oriented around mobile. And the huge opportunity here is that right now, there's really no good mobile platform for any chain. There's basic wallet functionality, but there's not any sort of mobile platform. And if you think about it, crypto is widely known as an attention economy. The vast majority of attention is on mobile for the vast majority of the world. And I would bet if you look at your screen time, you're probably spending, even if you're in crypto, you're probably spending the majority of your screen time on mobile. So mobile is an entirely new design space. We see that as the best opportunity to enable new metas. In addition to plugging in the native yield and the gas fee sharing, it's really just about what primitives can you create to enable entirely new metas. That's the key focus. And we don't really focus on anything else. And to the extent that like there's other chains, like if there's other chains focusing on that, then like that's where it's competitive. If there's other chains not, then there's competition, but it's along a different dimension than the normal competition that you would look at. I'm just reading through to try to find some other questions. Someone asks, if the vision is to go mobile friendly as a play, how does the Blast Foundation help games like Cambria build on the platform? So there will be an SDK release for Blast apps building on the platform. And again, it's really hard to understate how important the Blast app is. It's not going to look like anything that really exists in the market today. It's not something that I can really share in full detail about, but it's quite different. And there's going to be an SDK and a lot of technical support around actually integrating with the Blast app. And then I'm seeing a lot of questions around, we don't use Blast for fees, we don't buy back gas with chain fees. Again, this is something where it's really important to understand the long-term accrual. Blast governance does have the ability to turn on fees, both for the gas, which is what you would normally expect, and then also for the yield. But in terms of how do you value that, what really matters is the net present value of the future flows that you're able to capture. It is possible for the community to go and turn that on right now, but that would be jumping the gun because you're basically optimizing for short-term flows over the long-term flows. When just given the nature of financialized markets and exponential growth, the long-term flows are basically where all of the meat is at. So there is a direct connection between Blast and the ability to basically turn on fee capture, and more so than any other chain. But again, it's really, really important that the long-term flows are what are optimized for. Someone mentioned, according to phase 2 blog post for dApps that bridge to Blast, it seems that they're significantly disadvantaged for jackpots. I'm assuming they're meaning gold. Are these projects doomed to forever be second-rate dApps? When do they ever become native? So this is probably talking about the Blast native weight for gold distributions. And it's no secret that gold distributions favor Blast native dApps. So these are dApps that are only on Blast. Ideally, they're taking advantage of the native yield or the gas revenue sharing, or they are incorporating the Blast token itself into their dApp. Funnily enough, when we've seen dApps go multi-chain, often we've had a lot of dApps come from like Polygon or Base. In my memory, I can't think of a dApp that actually went from another chain to Blast and didn't end up becoming Blast native. Typically, they found significantly more success on Blast than any other chain. I think this has to do with just the user base. There's a lot of really active crypto natives on the chain, and we also try to surface new dApps. Even though it wasn't done as well as it could have been in the last phase, it's still done a lot more than other chains. So what we've actually found is that when dApps do go multi-chain, they typically see a lot more success on Blast, and then it's not really that hard to convince them to then go fully native and just really focus on Blast. So with that said, for any dApps that are multi-chain, it's something where we'll support them regardless of whether they're multi-chain or just Blast native. But we focus most of our attention and resources on the Blast native ones. We really want to make sure that the dApps committed to Blast succeed. And then typically what we see is that, again, they end up seeing more success on Blast, so it's usually not hard to have them switch over fully. What are your general thoughts on meme coins and their role in creating chain adoption? Are there any plans to incentivize them further on Blast? That's a great question, and the answer is absolutely. I think meme coins are really important for chain adoption. It's not the only thing that drives chain adoption, but it's one of the biggest drivers. At the end of the day, why do people come on chain? They come on chain because there's financial opportunities on chain that don't exist anywhere else. On chain is not really an ecosystem where it's like real world utility at the moment. That's not to say that's the case forever. Long term, and I lay this out in the this is laid out in the Vision blog post, but long term, you actually do have the ability to drive significant real world utility. But in terms of who's here now and why people are here now, it's absolutely because there's financial opportunities on chain that you can't get anywhere else. And meme coins are one of the best ways to do that. When I think through meme coins, at the end of the day, it's really, the prevailing theme in this space is that new metas, new games are the things that take off and not existing ones. So the focus is much less on like copy pasting existing meme coin metas over to Blast, but it's more so about enabling new meme coin metas. And again, this really comes down to how important the full stack chain thesis is to that. But meme coins are really important, and there is definitely going to be a big focus on that. And then Roy's asked, without some deflationary mechanic or utility or incentive for Blast, people might just sell Blast and leave the ecosystem and move on to different opportunities. There is a need for balance between short and long term. That's a great point. I do see that there is credibility to the idea that maybe some sort of like short term bridge is needed as the Blast like chain ecosystem fully builds out. In terms of the implementation of that, I think again it really comes down to there's a gut reaction that I see from the community when the price goes down to be like, oh, what can we turn on? Can we turn on staking or more points or anything like that to basically short term prevent that price action? That sort of reactionary behavior I've really never seen work in the history of crypto. I think ultimately what really matters is the long term value in the flows. But to the extent that there are any ideas that are effective in terms of maintaining community growth, which is very important for the success of the chain, that's something that I think is actually like worth discussing and exploring. It's less so about any sort of like reactionary mechanism, but it's more so about how can you actually give the community more buy-in basically to the success of the chain. But again, when it comes to any sort of like short-term reactionary mechanism, that's not typically something that I think it's something that is like as a gut reaction can make sense that it's like very reasonable to think will work, but historically doesn't ever work. And the thing that actually really only ever works is the underlying chain developing new primitives, developing traction, and basically creating new products that you can't get anywhere else. That's really where we've seen long-term chain growth come from. So that's really what the core focus is on. Someone asked, would you be so kind and let us mass auto scratch our in-app tickets? Absolutely. That's something that's going to go live within the next 14 days. Okay, so we're coming up on the hour now. I'm going to see if there's any other big pertinent questions that haven't been addressed. Probably take a few more, and then that'll conclude the AMA. This is a great question from Snowsledge. How are you planning to compete with onboarding versus Coinbase's base L2? So when you think about onboarding to a chain, the onboarding for every chain is actually pretty much the same right now for every chain, which is for most users, they just deposit from a CEX directly onto the chain. So there isn't really much differentiation in terms of how chains do onboarding. There is kind of this like meme that like Base has better onboarding, but it's kind of like the same that you would see for like Solana or any other L2, frankly. a key focus for Blast is enabling more streamlined user flows through the app. This is something that when you control the wallet, there's a lot that you can do there. So again, it's not something that I can really get into too significantly right now just due to competitive reasons, but the Blast app is really the foundation for a lot of unlocks in terms of what you can do as a chain. And that's going to be a key focus. Someone also add, will you add restaking to the native ETH? So this is also something that's like really important to understand is that currently the Blast ETH backing is Lido, and then the Blast USDB backing is MakerDAO. But those are implementation details. Those can be subbed out. It's kind of similar to, if you're creating a website, your website could be implemented in Python, it could be implemented in JavaScript, it could be implemented in PHP. You can change it whenever you want. There's some friction to doing it, but there's nothing really stopping you from doing it. So for Blast, the chain was designed so that the underlying backings can basically either be completely removed and substituted or supplemented. So long-term for Blast, I actually don't see any reason why this backing should be using third-party providers. There's no reason why there can't be a Blast native Lido or a Blast native Maker implementation, and there's no reason why it can't change to not just Blast staking or native ETH staking, but actually restaking. That is all possible. But again, I think that since this is an implementation detail, it's something that's less important near term than focusing on the underlying chain growth. Because as long as the underlying chain is growing, there's more use cases and there's more users, then the implementation detail of how the backing is structured can change at any point in time. And now someone asked, will dApps relying on the native yield be penalized in terms of gold because they couldn't add Blast mechanics? So absolutely not. The Blast native way it's basically just an OR statement. So for one, if a dApp is just solely on Blast, that already gets the Blast native weight. And then if the dApp is taking advantage of the native yield or the gas fee sharing or incorporating the Blast token, this is just a new way of basically being more Blast native. It's not something that affects any of the existing Blast native dApps. Someone asks, when will Blast fix their app website to allow access from a regular web page like 100% of other platforms? Asking users to install unaudited binaries in their device is awful for safety, especially since it was literally stated that's a PWA. So that's a great question. The Blast app, the way that PWAs work is that they're basically websites. So there isn't any plans on supporting the desktop PWA flow for users of the app. If you just go on your iPhone or your Android, you can install it as an app, but it's not actually quote unquote installing a binary.